So in this video I'm going to show you how I cut and baste the 60-degree kite shape, which when sewn together as a set of 6 looks like this. Okay, so the tools, the things that I've got is I've got my paper pieces here. I use an acrylic template and this has got a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I've got my fabric, wonder clips, basting thread, fabric scissors, thread snippers, and a needle for basting, and I tend to use a different needle for basting than the one for sewing. So I will show you how to cut them out. So you want to get your fabric, and the reason I quite like using the template is just because it makes it slightly easier for cutting and knowing that I've got enough of a seam allowance. So I'm just going to lay the template on top of the fabric and I'm going to snip into it and cut around. So because this acrylic template has got a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, it means I don't have to worry about adding an extra seam allowance or anything. It's already done for me. Just trim that off, and then what you want to do is thread your needle up. So you can use any thread for doing this. When you're cutting it, you don't want to cut it any longer than from your hand up to your elbow, otherwise you'll spend ages putting it through, which I do anyway. I know I'm saying don't do it, but I'll be honest, I do end up putting multiple arm's lengths through. So what I'm going to do now is tie a knot at the end of here. I realised I started doing that whilst I was talking, so I'm just going to snip that knot off and show you again. So you're going to cut the thread out from, I'm holding it between my thumb and my forefinger, and then I pull it up to my elbow and then snip there. Then to tie the knot, I'm going to see if I can get this right in focus now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loop it round 2 fingers, and then I'm going to pass the end of it through that loop, and then I pull it. You can see it's got 1 knot there, and then I'm going to do it for a second time. That's because I want this knot to be really strong and not have a risk of it pulling through the template and the fabric. So again, I've gone round 2 fingers, I then pass it through the loop, and because I want to make sure the knot is directly on top of it, I'm going to sort of hold the knot in between here, in between my thumb and finger, so that the 2 knots are then directly on top of each other. And it's the sort of thing that can take a bit of getting used to. So threading the needle, I'd say look the end of the thread, and then what you want to do, I'm going to get this up close here, is you want to hold the thread in between your thumb and forefinger with only a teeny tiny bit sticking out, and then take the needle down to the thread. Rather than taking the thread to the needle, take the needle down, and if it's done that, you see it's split there. So just snip it and then repeat it again. So I've just licked the end of the thread and I'm holding it between my thumb and forefinger and taking the needle down and threading it through, and then I'm going to pull it. This is going to be the tail of your thread, and you're going to pull it through. I kind of do it around about 1/3 of the way, and then you're ready to start basting. So for basting, we've cut it out. You then want to put your paper piece on the back. So I'm using 1 inch paper pieces. That means these 2 short edges are 1 inch, and when they're sewn together they'll form a 2 inch hexagon. So I'm going to place it on the back of the fabric, and I'm then just going to roughly by sight make sure that it's got a fairly even seam allowance. And I'm just going to use my clips to hold these 2 longer edges into place. Now the reason I like clips more than pins is if you put a pin right through the middle, it weakens the paper template, and I tend to use the paper templates multiple times, and I also find that it wiggles around a bit, so this you can see that doesn't leave any room for wiggling without the whole thing moving. So to baste it, you're going to fold the fabric over and then thumb press it into place. Then you're going to fold that over here. I'm going to get this really into focus now actually. Now you're going to fold that over there. I'm going to take my needle down through this fold, and you can see I'm going all the way through the fabric and through the paper and taking it, get that, and you can see the knot now is stopping it pulling through. so that's nice and strong. I'm then going to take a stitch back 3mm. Again, this is roughly, like, don't be worrying about measuring it out. So you can see I've gone down and now I've come back up, and I've only got a teeny tiny stitch on the front that's 3mm. I'm then going to take this clip off and use my thumb and really use the nail to dig it in there to get a really crisp point, and that's folded over like that. I'm going to take the stitch down, so it's now held that fold into place here. I'm going to come back 3mm, and now you're on the longer edge, so I tend to do a stitch halfway down, so halfway along this longer edge. If it's 1 inch, I'm quite happy just going straight across. If it's anything longer than 1 inch, which this is, it's 1.75, then I tend to do a stitch halfway along. So I'm going to take the needle all the way down and take the stitch back 3mm. And there's a reason why I'm doing such small stitches, and I'll show you once it's done. So when you get to this point here, so I know that I'm working anti-clockwise. If you work clockwise, that's absolutely fine. You want to make sure that you work in the same direction for each of your templates. So it doesn't matter if it's clockwise or anti-clockwise, as long as it's the same direction each time, that's fine. And that's because we're going to create these little tails here. So you can see that I used my thumb and really put the nail into the edge of the template there, fold it over to get that really crisp point. And then I'm going to take it down all the way through, and then take another stitch about 3mm, and then the same one here, and we come up towards the end of it now. And then on your last one, because obviously you've started here, so you've just got one corner, so that can sometimes be a little bit more fiddly, but you just want to use your thumb, tuck it under, and then take your needle down on that last fold. Now this works really nicely because it holds all these folds into place. The thread is kind of acting as a kind of going over the top and holding it into place. So you want to come through about 3mm, and then you're going to tie a knot. So again, the way I'm going to do this is 2 knots. So I'm going to create a loop and pass my needle through, and then I'm going to put my finger here because this is where I want the knot to be, and as I pull the thread, that knot is now formed there. I'm going to do that a second time, put my finger on where I want the knot to be, pull it through, and you can see it's got a double knot there. So I'm going to snip it, so it's about, again, 2 or 3mm, and that is how you baste the kites. So you can see here, if I get this back in focus, I've got the really teeny tiny stitches on it, and the reason that this really helps and comes into its own is because when you start doing the focus cutting, it doesn't detract. So you can see I've got, let me get it in focus again, I feel like I need that on a t-shirt, I spend it so often. These teeny tiny stitches where I've taken them 2 or 3mm don't detract from the overall block, and it really allows you to see the overall image that's being created without the big basting stitches across it. But if you want to do big basting stitches, and that's absolutely fine too, because it's your block. And the other reason I wanted to show you, the reason the tails, it's important they all face in the same direction, is because on the back when we sew them together, they'll then nest one on top of the other like that. So go ahead and repeat 6 of those. And then when you repeat it 6 times, you can see, because the tails are all going in the same direction, they'll nest one on top of the other like that. Whereas obviously if your tails were going in different directions, if this tail were going like that, you can see that that's going to be much harder to stitch together because they're not going to sit nicely alongside one another. So that's the reason why it's important to make sure your tails all go in the same way, and it really doesn't matter whether they're going clockwise or anti-clockwise, as long as it's all the same on all your kites. And then watch the next video on how to sew them together.